Breaking news now, live from New York, with your host, Mr. Wong. Good morning, class. This is your host, Mr. Wong. I'm just out here in New York. I have no idea why they keep sending me to the places that have the most victims of the coronavirus. That's why they gave me this mask. Actually, thanks to my mom. She actually made it for me. Thanks, Mom. Shout out to the mom. Anywho, yes, so I'm in New York, and if you guys haven't heard, today was the worst day in the U.S. for the coronavirus. And what they're saying is New York is going crazy right now. So if you look, this is the Brooklyn Bridge. But in New York, the death rate and the coronavirus victims are now 5 times higher than anywhere else in the U.S. So New York has become an area where it is infected, and it's really dangerous right now. 56% of all the cases in all of the United States are now coming from New York, and 60% of all the new cases are all 60% of the new cases are all from New York as well. So New York has become the epicenter in the United States of the coronavirus. So we just have to always still make sure that we are washing our hands, staying safe. Do not touch your face. Thank goodness they gave me this mask over here from New York. But I just wanted to give you a quick little update of what's going on in New York. California, we are still going strong. We're doing okay. But as soon as I get back, hopefully I don't bring the coronavirus back to LA, because I want to go back to school already. But yeah, so I'm gonna cut this thing short because I really do want to get back to California, where I know I can be safe at my house. So for today's news, thanks for listening. What's up, guys? I'm back now, back home, back safe. I love that private jet that they sent me on, because it's first class all the way back. But before we start this episode or this new learning today, I do want to give a shout out to one person. Yes, that is right. We are going to give a shout out to Oscar today, because for some reason today, or excuse me, yesterday, was he actually turned in some work. So let's give him a round of applause. Thank you, Oscar, for actually finally doing your work. Let's make sure we do it every single day. And for the rest of you guys, shout out to all the other sixth graders as well, because you guys have been really responsible with your work, messaging me if you guys have questions, turning everything in on time. So good job to all you guys as well. So yesterday we talked about these wars, the Persian Wars, and we talked about how the Persian Empire wanted to expand, but at one point there was a rebellion in Asia, and these Greek city-states started to go and rebel against Darius. Darius did not take this kindly, and what he did was he wanted to get revenge. And what he did was we're going to go ahead and send a bunch of people to Greece and show them not to mess with the Persian Empire. So when they did this, then we started to have all these other Greek city-states step up and say, well, if they're going to come and attack Greece, then we're going to go ahead and help everybody out, because we are all Greeks and we want to take care of our people. We got introduced to the Marathon. This is how we got the term Marathon, because of the first battle at the city called Marathon, where the Greeks actually defeated the Persians because they were a lot more clever, and they had smarter generals, and pretty much the Persians weren't really expecting that, and the Greeks had had better weapons than the Persians. The second battle was 10 years later, and this is when Xerxes, Darius's son, decided to come and attack. He wanted to go ahead and attack Athens and said, let's just go take down Athens. During this time, though, the Spartans, the really brave Spartans, I don't know if you guys did check out that video that I left in the comments. If not, you should check it out. The Spartans was a really brave soldiers, and which we're going to talk about today. And they defended this thing of the pass called Thermopylae, and they knew that they had to go through this little canyon, but if they can hold them off just long enough, then the Greeks in Athens can escape and they can get ready for war, and they can just be safe. So thank goodness the Spartans, they did lose, but they fought with honor, and they kind of stalled the Persians from going in a little bit quicker than before. Then the last one was the battle at Salamis, and this is when the Greeks really showed off their skills and their cleverness and their expertise at sailing, when the Persians brought over a bunch of huge ships, because they thought the more men the better, but that wasn't the case, because they eventually did not know the landscape. They didn't know that Greece was full of peninsulas, like we all know, like the lands were like this. So what they did was they trapped in the big ships here, and then all the Greek ships came in, and then they started to attack, and eventually they won that war. And although the Persians lost, they were still very, very powerful. They didn't really care. They said, all right, fine, the Greeks won. But to the Greeks, this was a huge win for them, because they were able to defend their city, defend their land. And now they didn't have to really worry about the Persians coming back to attack them, because now the Persians kind of respected them a little bit. Okay? So today what we're going to do is we're going to jump into a whole new section, and we're going to start to talk about the Spartans and the Athenians, because now the Spartans and Athens, even though they were friends, they are now going to go to war. But first we're going to talk about the Spartan, their society, and why they were so heavily influenced by the military. Okay, so let's get to it. All right, so as we go through this content, just think of what city you would want to be from. Would you rather be from Sparta or would you rather be from Athens? And based off this, you'll let me know when we're done with this section. Okay? So two of the greatest city-states in Greece were Sparta and Athens. Both very different, though. Sparta had a culture that valued physical strength and military might. Everything was based on the army and military and strength, while the Athenian culture was more placed on the value of the mind. These were the thinkers. These were the people that just thought a lot about things. However, both city-states had military strength, and they both played important roles in the defense of ancient Greece. So let's get into it. Today we're only going to talk about Sparta. So when the Spartans first started to create their society, back in 900 to 600 BC, they were faced to make a decision. So they had this leader, his name was Lycurgus, and Lycurgus, what he was doing was he had this territory and he had all these people. Unfortunately, there was a huge slave revolt. All their slaves that he owned, they started to revolt against his power and his rule. From doing this, the Spartans started to believe that the military was the only way to keep things in order. So what he did was the Spartans, they started to put all their focus on the military, because they thought that the military was the only way to provide security and to provide protection for their city. And because of this, they wanted to stop revolts ever from happening again. They kind of became a little bit paranoid. So everything was focused on military. And because of this reflected their daily life, their lifestyles, things that they did. And as soon as they were bored, it was military, military, military. So let's go ahead and move on. So the daily life in Sparta, it was dominated by the army. Even the kids were dominated by the army, even as soon as they were born. So when boys were born back then in Sparta, as soon as they were born, a government official would go and look at the baby. And they would just look at the baby. And we all know babies are crying. Some of them are cute, some of them look old already when they come out. But what they would do is they would look at these babies, and if the baby looked like it wasn't healthy or it looked like it wasn't strong, the government official would take the baby away from the family, take it out to the middle of the desert or the middle of the land, and just leave it out there for it to die. Really, really sad. But they wanted only strong men. So healthy boys that were there, they kept all healthy babies, and they started to train the boys from a really young age to be soldiers. So some of their trainings that they would do was the boys would run, they would swim, they would jump, they would throw javelins or spears to increase their strength. And pretty much what they'd do is they would put them through these hardships, or put them through tough situations, because they wanted to make these kids tough. So for example, all boys, no kids were allowed to wear shoes. Nobody was given clothes or heavy clothes. They just had like whatever they were wearing. They didn't give them any jackets, even in the winter, because they wanted them to build this thing like a mental toughness. They wanted them to be strong and not rely on material things. They wanted them to rely and stay focused on their military skills. They even weren't given food. Some of these kids were not given food, and what they were expected to do was steal it. And they were expected to steal food, but if they got caught stealing, then they would be punished or even killed. Really, really crazy, really strict to be a kid in Sparta. There's one story that the king spoke of, that this kid, he stole a fox and he got caught. But he didn't want to admit that he got caught, because he knew that he would get punished, possibly even killed. So what he did was he kept the fox, and he kept the fox tucked under his shirt. And pretty much what that fox did, the fox kind of like tore his stomach up, and he eventually died from the fox. But this was one strength or one thing about these Spartan boys, is that they were taught and raised to have courage and strength. That was the only thing that was important. And so when they did this, they showed courage and strength, and pretty much this kid was kind of idolized even though that was going on. So most of them, as they started to grow up, most of these soldiers, they believed that the most important quality of a good soldier was self-discipline and obedience. This was the best part of being a soldier. Also, when you were a kid, you were starting to train from when you were a baby all the way up until you were 18. And then once you became age 20 to 30, you lived amongst all those boys. You didn't really see your families. You were pretty much in the army. And once you started in the army, you pretty much served in the army until you were 60 years old. So your whole life was going to be fighting and protecting the city. So from the time you were born to 60, the military is all you ever knew. One thing about these Spartans is that they didn't know what luxuries were. They didn't know what expensive food was. They didn't know what shoes were. They didn't know what furniture was. And pretty much all they knew was what they had and protection and to fight. So now we're going to talk about the girls and the women in Sparta. So because most of the Spartan men were often always away from home, the women had more rights than other Greek women. So the women, they owned much of the land in Sparta. They ran their households. While their husbands were gone, they owned businesses. They pretty much took care of the city because most of the men were gone. Unlike these other women in other Greek cities, Spartan women didn't spend time weaving clothes, washing dishes, or making things like that. They all thought that this was stuff for slaves. Like, they have bigger, important things to do. Slaves, yes, they're the ones that can go ahead and do this. And they weren't slaves. So as Spartan wives and Spartan girls and women in the society, they had other things to do. And they still did, and what these things that they did was they did physical training, because if anyone was to attack the city and all the men were gone, the women were the ones that were going to defend the city. So these women, although they weren't part of the military, they did go and practice these physical trainings. They would learn how to run, jump, wrestle, throw spears and javelins. And sometimes these women, they would compete in these sporting events. If you didn't know, the Olympics, which is coming up soon, hopefully, it all started in Greece. That's why if you look at the old Greek Olympics or the old statues, most of them are naked, and it's because they all started over here in Greece. And these were the people that competed in these Olympics: running, jumping, throwing the javelins, throwing the spears. These are all sporting events, and this is where the first Olympics was created, which is kind of cool. So the women, not typical women, they didn't sew, they didn't do anything that was stuff for the slaves. They did other things like protect the city, run the households, run businesses, and make sure that the city was good while the husbands were gone away training in the military. So Sparta was actually officially ruled by two kings who were also in charge of the army, but they really didn't have all the power. The people who had the most power in Sparta were these elected officials, people that people voted for. They actually had more power than these kings. These officials ran Sparta's day-to-day activities, such like in the cities, while the kings were out training for the army. And these officials actually also handled all deals between Sparta and other cities. Sparta's government was set up to control these things called helots, the city helots, and these helots, or the city helots, were their slaves. So the government, their main focus was to control the slaves. The slaves pretty much did everything in the city, while the people of Sparta, all they did was train for the army. I'm just going to keep repeating that because it was all military based. So these slaves, they grew all the city's crops. They did all the jobs, such as making clothes, washing clothes, stuff like that. Jobs that typically the women would do. And pretty much these slaves, their jobs were miserable. And remember, the reason why they made these slaves' jobs so miserable is because they feared, they wanted these slaves to fear the Spartans. If you remember when we first started talking, the slaves are the ones that rebelled against Sparta in the very first place. That's why they went to a very strict military society. So they wanted these slaves to have a miserable life, and they wanted them to fear the Spartan army, so they would never come back and attack or rebel against the Spartans. So as a quick review, the Spartan society was all based on military. From a young age for the boys, they started to train. If you weren't even a strong baby, you were left to die. These boys were put through all these hard situations to build mental toughness. And remember, for the men in the military, it was all about courage, bravery, self-discipline, and obedience. The women, they had a lot more powers and a lot more rights than other women had in Greece. They didn't do the typical jobs such as cleaning the house, making clothes. Those were jobs for slaves. The women were actually training as well, just in case they needed to protect the city. Um, the government in Sparta was based with two kings and elected officials. The two kings were pretty much just the army generals, and the elected officials were the ones that ran the whole city. And pretty much they based their whole government on making sure that these slaves were put to work, feared the Spartan society or feared the Spartan army, and that their lives were miserable. So that's pretty much what life in Sparta was. So if you guys were thinking about living in Sparta, maybe the army is right for you, or maybe all this discipline and obedience is good for you. So for homework, I want you guys to answer these three questions. What was the most important element of the Spartan society? Like, what was the most influential in the society? Number two, why did the Spartan elected officials have more power than the kings? And number three, describe the roles of the men and women in Sparta. For this, if you want, you can make a chart and you can just put men and these are the roles. And then you can put women and these are the roles. I'll accept bullet points on this. Once again, just don't forget to write down the questions and answer in complete sentences. Perfect. So today we talked about the Spartan military society. Once again, if you guys have any questions, please let me know in the comments or through Google Classroom, and I can get back to you as soon as I can. If not, I'll see you guys in your Zoom session, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. See ya.